Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be joining you today, and I see my colleague David Calloway with me. And I'm seeing that there's a little bit of technical difficulties, but we are going to get started and get moving, hopefully on time. My name is Hollis Mccarthy, and I'm the outreach educator with the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to the First Amendment and helping people understand what their First Amendment rights are. And I have with me David Calloway, who is the manager of the Georgia 3Rs project with our Religious Freedom Center. And I'm so excited to be having this conversation with him. And hopefully one of my colleagues will be joining me a little bit later to help us dive even deeper into this. But before we start asking wonderful questions, and I hope everyone in our audience has wonderful questions about understanding the First Amendment, I'm going to give us a little bit of an overview so we all are on the same page with what we are talking about today. So let me share my screen. Let's see. Give me 1 second. All right. Unfortunately, screen sharing isn't working, but that's okay. I am triple prepared for this. So what we're going to be talking about today is the First Amendment. So let's get started. What on earth is the First Amendment? Why should we care about understanding it? And how do we get to having something with such a fancy sounding name? So we're going to have to time travel backwards about 200 years to the start of America, the country we know today. As happens in politics, the two main parties of the time didn't really agree on absolutely everything that should go into our new Constitution. And at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the big debate was over how strong to make the central or federal government. Opponents of the first draft of the Constitution felt if you made it too strong, that could lead to tyranny and jeopardize the freedoms that we just had a revolution to gain. Other sides said, we need to have a Bill of Rights. What rights do people in this new country have? We need to write those down and put them in the Constitution so everyone knows what's going on. Spoiler alert, the Constitution is ratified and there is no Bill of Rights. That comes a few years later. And the Bill of Rights, as we know it, is the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And they're known as the Bill of Rights. Now, the very first one of the Bill of Rights is the First Amendment. It's the first change made to the Constitution. And I want to take a look at this chat. For anyone watching, can anyone name one of the 5 freedoms of expression in the First Amendment? David, you can't answer because I know you can name all 5. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat to see if anyone. Yes, I'm already seeing the answers coming in. Awesome. We have speech, religion. Awesome. Excellent. What other freedoms? Anyone else? Press. Yes. 2 for press. Double vote. This is when we get into the less known of freedoms. Yes. Assembly. Awesome. Last one. Can we go for all 5? I knew this would be a good group. 10 seconds left. Get your answers in. Yeah, so close. Petition, yeah, protest. So amazing when we get a group where we get all 5 of the freedoms. That makes our First Amendment hearts very happy. So yeah, we get these 5 freedoms under the First Amendment, and we need to look at the actual language of the First Amendment, and it reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, which is some very, very late 18th century language, but what does that mean? Well, let's break it down so we know what we're talking about. The first part, Congress shall make no law. Does that really mean that it's just Congress, the House and the Senate are the only ones who this applies to, and all the rest of the government, from the local to the other branches, aren't part of this? No. It means that the government, here called Congress and the law, can't limit your First Amendment freedoms in public places. And I used some key words in there. But does this apply to private companies or private schools or your parents? Can your friends get mad at you for what you say? Well, I feel like we're going to have a bigger conversation about that. But the short answer is First Amendment doesn't apply to private individuals or companies. So, if you're in a place of work or a private school, things like that, those can all be places where you see your First Amendment freedoms limited. Now, the other thing is, the law is not very clear about what this means and what steps are in the Constitution and which branches get involved if there are issues. We made this law, it was brand new, they never had it before, and the First Amendment kind of grew in our understanding over time. In our second session today, which I hope you'll join us for, we're going to dive even more into that. Like, how do we use these rights now that we know what they are? Now, I want to dive a little closer into the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. And the first one, religion, I think it's the first third of the law. The words are right there for the first one. And it's complicated. It's got 2 parts. And I'm looking to where David is on my screen because I know he's going to help me out with that. And it means you can believe what you want. You can belong to any religion or no religion at all. The second freedom, which was the first we got in our chat, was speech. And it's, you can voice your words using symbols or actions or anything that conveys meaning forward into the world. So there's symbolic speech, and then there's literally talking speech, like I'm doing right now. And then there's all forms of ways and languages with this speech. The next one is press. And this basically boils down to the government can't censor information in newspapers or online news sources or TV news or broadcasts. It can't really tell us what to publish. And assembly. Now, this freedom is at its core, you can gather in a group because there's some things that are easier to do when there's more than one of you, and it can support the freedoms or even be a way that we practice some of our freedoms. Think about gathering in, say, a house of worship, or gathering to exercise our next freedom we'll talk about, petition, which is you can criticize the government and ask for change that might affect, for policies that might affect you negatively, or for positive change, or to ask them, no, don't make that change. We don't want to see that. So we have those in there. Now, I keep talking about freedoms, and then I'm about to use a word that we don't often pair with freedom, which is limits. Wait a second, how are they freedoms if there's limits involved? Well, one big thing that is kept in mind with the First Amendment, if we see limits and what limits we see, is harm. It's a really easy way to summarize it, is to think about that. And what do I mean by harm? To cause hurt or damage. And this can be in a wide way. It could be literally physical harm, using our words to cause something bad to happen, or harm to reputation, hurting someone's reputation, maybe by telling something that's not true, especially, or harming the country's security. We can't reveal state secrets using our speech, or can we? We'll find out from our specialists. But it's not as simple as just, oh, all these things that are harmful are banned. It's way more complicated than that. And so when we think about the First Amendment, we have to balance both what these freedoms mean and are there limits and how do those work out, which not only does this make it more complex than my short introduction makes it seem, but we have 200 years of us figuring out the First Amendment in American history to work with. Now, everyone, I want to make sure we have time for all of your amazing questions, but I want to start with one of my own. And David, I'd really like you to take this question in. Let me see. So when I say we have these freedoms, does that mean we are completely protected from any repercussions or negative reactions from others for using them? Like, is it a problem if my friend gets mad at me for using the First Amendment? Have they broken the Constitution?
That's a really great question. And thank you everyone for bringing us. So, there's some places where there are limits, but you are, as Jesse really mentioned and started to talk about, you're not allowed to use your First Amendment rights to cause harm, and in particular bodily harm. So my focus for the Freedom Forum is on religious freedom, and so, for example, there are Supreme Court cases that say you are not allowed to, even if your religion, which is protected, you can practice it as much as you want, except you can't do child sacrifice. That's not okay, right? So there are certain places where that comes up in limits. But then there's a lot of gray area too. There's this kind of space in between where you might have the right to exercise, your First Amendment rights, but the way you do that can also be really impactful to the outcomes you want. So if you want to sow division and not find common ground and argue with people, you can use your First Amendment right to free speech to do that. But you can also use that same, First Amendment right to speech to try and find some common ground without giving up, your deepest beliefs either. So that gray area is up to us to decide on how we want to engage with the First Amendment.
Well, that sounds like a lot of responsibility. Isn't there an easier way to do this where I don't have to make so many choices? Wait, couldn't there be clearer, or is the gray area the important part of the First Amendment?
It's both and, right? I think, for us, we often talk about the idea that you have these rights, but you also have a responsibility to protect those rights for others. And as many of you all tuning in know, as your teachers have taught you, your rights are best protected when you fight for those same rights for other people. So I often use an example in my work where I talk about a mosque that was trying to be built here in Georgia. A group of Muslims was petitioning for a mosque to be built to the city council, and that council denied the permit for that mosque to be built, and the newspapers reported it that way. They said, the city council denies permit for mosque to be built. But what that should say is place of worship, because there's no difference from the government standpoint. And that's true for all of your rights. If we make it easy to deny the rights of one group, we make it easy to deny your rights too. And there's going to be a moment in your time, just as President Biden said today, where you're going to need a hand, right? You're going to need someone to be able to reach out and help you. And that reciprocal responsibility will make sure that your rights are protected too.
Excellent. And I see someone has shared a question in the chat, and it's a really good one. Can the freedoms be stopped? Can the government stop us from using any of our freedoms? And I see we have First Amendment specialist and senior fellow Jean. Hopefully audio is coming in. Hi.
I hope you can.
We can. I'm so excited you were able to join us. For everyone, this is Jean Polisinski, our senior fellow for the First Amendment. And if you're ready, I'd like to bounce this question to you. Can the freedoms of the First Amendment be stopped?
They can't be stopped. They can't be taken away. They, as you suggested, there can be certain kinds of limits, but it can't be because of what the content of what we say, the ideas that we express. What we say at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe in the middle of a park, we might be restrained from saying that at 3 a.m. in a loudspeaker under somebody's bedroom window. But it's not because of the content of what they're saying or the viewpoint they have. It's because what's called time, place, and manner. It's just not there. You have to balance the right of, say, you or me to have peace and quiet in our home or be able to go to sleep at night. But you can't stop those freedoms. The government can intrude only very narrowly for a very specific reason and only a certain short period of time. So we never lose our freedoms and they can't be stopped.
Excellent. So I want to kind of get this out there because I think we talk about limits. And you mentioned something really key, Jean, about we can't limit it because the idea is And David, you talked about defending someone else's freedoms, even if we don't necessarily disagree with them. How does that help us understand the First Amendment? Why is it important to uphold First Amendment expression that we don't disagree or that we don't agree with? I'm going to start with you, David, since you introduced it first. And then, Jean, I want to hear your thoughts on this too.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first and most important reason is, again, because you want that right for yourself. But it's really important that, listen, there are a lot of people out there there are over 1,000 hate groups identified by the FBI in the last year that are actively working to divide us. And they have, free speech rights to do that. But we have to, say to ourselves, okay, if there's all of this active kind of division, then how are we going to use our free speech rights, if we want, and in opposition to that? It doesn't necessarily mean we have to shut down people we disagree with. Again, that makes it very easy to shut down our own rights in a different place. I like to tell people all the time, somewhere you are a minority of thought, right? Like somewhere we can put you in this country where you believe something that most of the people around you don't believe, and we want to protect that for as long and as deeply as we can. And the more we limit the rights of others, the more we make it easy to limit that for ourselves.
I agree with that, David. I think there was a Supreme Court justice in the 1940s who, in making a decision, writing an opinion, said, we need sometimes to hear those things we find even vile and repugnant, sort of the worst things you could hear, if only to be better prepared to argue against them. So it is that idea that if we don't know what the opposition is saying or the people whose thoughts we don't agree with, we can't really effectively counter those arguments. And that is a very important underlying part about the First Amendment. It assumes that we will speak out, that we will be engaged. The First Amendment, as you like to say, isn't for sissies. The First Amendment is for people who are willing to be engaged. If you want to sit back and let somebody else do it, that's a quick ticket to losing our freedoms. The First Amendment presumes you will be engaged and that you will join in the debate.
All right. Now I have to ask a question now that I'm getting a little bit of an idea on some limits and what speech that I'm betting are in some students' minds. Why can my public school have a dress code or make me wear a uniform? Wait a second. At the beginning, you said some speech is symbolic. It's not spoken. Isn't my clothing speech? So I'm going to open that to whoever wants to tackle it.
Well, let me take a stab at it, and then David can certainly amplify it. But the mere wearing of clothing, just general clothing, the blue pullover I've got on now, sort of a checkered shirt, isn't, in the court's eye, rise to the level of speech. There are some articles of clothing that have. The Supreme Court has said at times, if you wore during a campaign season something supporting a candidate, and you're doing it more than just to wear it to be ornamental or poke fun. Maybe you're working on the campaign, or your school has a forum in which you are going to speak out about various candidates, or you simply have a willingness to say, I want to talk about this with anybody, and they're going to see that shirt and know I want to talk about, in the last case, Trump or Biden. That is protected speech. But the courts have also said to students for about the last 45 years, you never lose your rights. You always have them. But school authorities, in order to maintain order, be able to teach, or to avoid intruding on the rights of other students, can limit your right at a given moment. Doesn't mean always you don't lose them, but the court has approved some temporary limits on them. I don't always agree with those limits, frankly. I think you ought to be able to say what you want. Now, granted, you can't stand up in the middle of a math course and start giving a political speech. That's not going to work. But when you want to talk about a candidate, or you want to say something serious, or be engaged in a discussion about public issues, from my point of view, you ought to be able to. I will have to tell you, the courts don't always agree with that.
That's great, Gene. I want to add that there's language the Supreme Court uses as in the past called a compelling state interest when it comes to schools, and your teachers, your principals, your district officials, they have a compelling interest to keep you safe and to educate you according to your state standards. And those the court is willing to say, some things like getting up and giving a political speech in the middle of math class. Get in the way of those state interests that can prevail. But the court also says that there has to be kind of the least involvement of the government in that process as possible. And so, for in the realm of religious freedom, you can't go in and make all of these, rules that then get the government involved in it either, right? You can't come in, that's also equally frowned upon.
So with this idea, you're sort of saying kind of temporary limits. And I want to look at that word and that phrase for a moment, because we're going through a global pandemic right now. And when I read the language of the First Amendment, I really was thinking about the freedom of religion, where it says that the Congress shall make no law about respecting the establishment or exercise of religion. But we can't gather in groups right now. And for a lot of people, that's a huge portion of their religion. How does that actually add up with the First Amendment? Because it's been a long time for those limits. What's going on?
Yeah, I'll start, and I'd love for Gene to kind of add. It's really complicated, and in fact, we've seen a switch in the Supreme Court only in the last about 6 weeks. For most of 2020, the Supreme Court was ruling usually against religious claimants, saying, hey, we have the right to free exercise, and we are being limited in our ability to do that by things like indoor capacity rules and stuff like that. And the Supreme Court mostly said, we're not going to take those cases up, or we're not going to see them, because there's a precedent that comes from the 1990s that basically says, if the government is treating all organizations fairly, and religious organizations happen to be part of that group, then there isn't necessarily, the government doesn't have to give special exceptions for the religious group. So, for example, in May of 2020, the Supreme Court declined to hear a case from California arguing that they should be able to, under free exercise, the right to free exercise, assemble, because the court said, look, every other organization, like movie theaters and pools and all sorts of other stuff that is not religion falls under the same rules, and so since they're being treated fairly, that's okay. That's switched recently, and it does seem the court's going to start allowing more exceptions for that. And I'll trade it off to Gene if he'd like to add something.
David, I think you've done a good summary of it. The arguments are many times. And by the way, the laws of allowing the government to impose certain restrictions during pandemics or epidemics go all the way back into the 1915s, when Massachusetts had a smallpox epidemic, and they sort of the court cases there established the right of government to quarantine and then enact certain kinds of limits. So we're talking about rules that have been in place to give the government certain powers for more than 100 years. But what's happening is, I think people initially said, let's treat everybody fairly the same way. And that has a nice ring to it. But I think what religious organizations are arguing now is that, unlike a restaurant, which could maybe offer takeout food or serve people outside, for certain faiths, the gathering together in a certain place at a certain time is intrinsic to the operation of their faith. They can't operate. In effect, they can't do a takeout service, if you want to compare it to a restaurant. And the court is beginning to listen to that. Now, those who counter that say, wait a minute, very often in church services, there is speaking loud, there is singing, there is sharing, hugging, maybe sharing food or some other item. And those are ways that the virus can be transmitted. So unlike a movie theater, for example, where you could sit 6 or 8 seats apart, you don't speak normally when the movie's on. At least you're not supposed to. These religious services that involve speaking and singing and passing of food or whatever are different. So I think that we do have this argument, and I kind of go back to what I always call the court of common sense. If that being together is important to you, it doesn't restrain your First Amendment rights, to me, to say, well, we will stand 8 feet apart, or further apart if we're going to sing, that we might share food symbolically. We might place food on a table as opposed to giving it to another person. Could there be, now again, I don't want to violate anyone's religious practices by suggesting something that they don't approve of. But let's try that sort of common sense approach. One of the things that pains me about today's society is that we so often take these conflicts over how we view things to court. Let's just sue people about it. And I would call, I think the First Amendment, again, presumes a certain reasonableness. The whole point of having it is that we talk to each other without the government interfering. And then when we sue, we bring the government in, or at least the courts. So I understand that the courts are there, and independent judiciary exists to settle these kinds of disputes. So it's not improper. But I do wish people would take some more time to talk about these things, as the First Amendment presupposes we will do freely, and come up with a solution that can accommodate, that can tolerate, that can encourage, actually, certain kinds of services. And again, not a perfect solution. I don't live in the fantasy world that everybody's going to say, oh, wonderful, and go on. We're going to sometimes have to sue and go to court and see what the law says. But I do think that there are opportunities here, particularly in matters of faith, which are so deeply held by so many people. To me, the first tenet of having that deep faith ought to be an ability to reach out to others and try to understand them. I may not always agree, but I think we could try that sometime.
I'm hearing a recurring theme coming through in the answers and the questions is that there's a resiliency and personal responsibility in the First Amendment, that these freedoms are very much ours. And while there are spaces where they can be limited, I see a question in the chat saying, for example, for people who are in prison, can the freedoms be limited or taken away while serving time? I think the answer is they can be limited, but not taken away completely, especially this resiliency of faith that you were talking about both. And really, it's a good reminder in the answers to these questions that the First Amendment freedoms belong to the people in the United States, and using them is ours, and the protections are ours, and the responsibility is ours. Now, everyone, I see we have 1 minute left, and I know there's more questions, but the good news is we're set up for our second session on how do we use these freedoms. So please join us for our next session later this afternoon, and we will answer all your questions on using your First Amendment rights. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining me, and hopefully I'll see all of you later.
I am Darby, one of the moderators from Education First. A big thank you to Jesse, David, and Jean from the Freedom Forum. This, as Jesse mentioned, is part one of the two-part series today. That second session will begin at 2:30 p.m. Again, you can find that on the Sessions tab, and you'll see that appear right at 2:25, so we'll open it 5 minutes early. That session will continue on the First Amendment, focus on using your rights. But for now, please head back to that main stage. You'll have a short break, and then another speaker from the UN Foundation coming up that you won't want to miss. So big thank you to this team. That was terrific and a great conversation. And thank you everyone at home for engaging as well. So we'll see you back on the main stage. And this team, I'll see you for session 2.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.